through it. Tonight, we're going to do a presentation. I'm going to share what I meant to share at this conference. And then I'm going to do an exercise so you can actually have an experience of what I'm talking about. There's no way we can do a whole constellation about this tonight, because the collective constellation is usually a minimum of 3 hours to kind of really get into it, and then some process to unwind and to process it. So, but I will give you a flavor of what that even is. When I put this together, I thought I'm speaking to people who are facilitators for constellations or who have a lot of understanding of constellations already. So hopefully I've made it in a way that everybody is kind of keeping up with what I'm talking about and can follow what this all is about. So I've been a constellation facilitator for over 20 years at this point, been in this business a long time. And the Inner Arts Institute, which is my place here in Watertown, has been training people to be facilitators for 17 years. And we started hitting this moment of moving into the collective in 2013, because that is when the Boston Marathon bombing happened here in Boston. And the manhunt for the young man, you may remember, went into Watertown, which is where our institute is. And it was, I've never seen so much police, so much military, so much helicopters in my life as in those 2 days that they were looking for this young man. And it so happened that 2 days later, we had our constellation training group. And it was completely clear that there was no way we could just do business as usual, because everybody was very, very affected by what had happened. Some of the people knew the young man, some of the people had relatives at the finish line, somebody knew people who died. So that it was just too in the room not to address it. That day was the first day we did a collective trauma constellation. We tried to understand what happened here and how is it connected. And we started putting up the police and the victims and the perpetrators and the government and the military. We just started exploring what is in the field when these big things happened. That's the first time we tried this out. And from there on, I realized there was a lot of learning to do. And I ended up being in particular training programs for the next 10 years. The first one was with Thomas Hübel, called the Pocket Project, which was a training in how to deal with collective trauma in an effective way. So I've been a part of the Pocket Project ever since, and we have continued to experiment with how to work with this. And I'm actually really happy and grateful I get to share what I've learned in those 10 years with you tonight, because for one, I think it's really, really important in this time in our culture that we look at the collective, because it just seems to be happening around us in such intensity at the moment. And also I'm happy to share some of the mistakes I made, because I don't think everybody has to do the same hard learning, because it's not easy to sit with a collective and in that intense energetic field. So that's kind of where I begin, and I'm going to share my screen so you can see the PowerPoint we created for that. And I want to first quickly introduce you to my partner, Maya. Maya, can you wave so people can see you over there? Maya is holding the tech in the background. So if you have any issues or something isn't working, you can text her in the chat so she can help you with things. And she also made all the graphics on this presentation. So thank you for that. So here we go. Let's see, share screen. Play from start. Slideshow. discard. Mm-mm. Hang on, still not getting it quite right. There we go. Okay, I have this guest thing in the middle. How do I get rid of that? There we go, now it's gone. Okay, so I called it Beyond the Ancestral Field, and you'll shortly see why. In this slideshow, I weave together several different strands of my learning over the last however many years. I'm actually trained as a psychologist in Germany, and I have been doing a lot of body-oriented psychotherapy. So some of that comes in. I also have looked much in the indigenous cultures because I really love their knowledge and believe that that knowledge will be very helpful to us in these difficult times that we're moving through. So you'll find these strands woven together, and I actually begin with one quote that is from a friend of mine and a colleague who we hosted just a couple of months ago. His name is Tiokasin Ghost Horse. Tiokasin is a Lakota, member of the Lakota people, and he travels the world just teaching their knowledge. And so I wanted to start with one of his quotes where he says, "This is the hardest time to live, but it is also the greatest honor to be alive now and to be allowed to see this time. There is no other time like now. We should be thankful, for creation did not make weak spirits to live during this time. The old ones say, this is the time the strongest spirits will live through, and those who are empty shells, those who have lost the connection, will not survive. We have become masters of survival. We will survive. It is our prophecy to do so." So with this beginning, I want to introduce a few key concepts that kind of underlie my understanding of working in the healing business. I called it eagle medicine. That is a way that indigenous people see the teachings of the eagle is that he looks down from way up high. So there is a very large perspective taken, and it is a good medicine to have. And one of the concepts there is that life has an inbuilt movement towards balance and healing. There's always a desire to balance and heal in life. And you can think of it as energy or light flowing through form, that life is transmitted through our bodies, or that of any relation of ours, any animal, any tree. Life moves through these forms. And for us humans, this transmission is conducted through our nervous system because it's an electrical transmission. And it's easy to understand when you think of it, much like an electrical current that flows through your lines in your house. There is an energy that flows through and turns the light on. That's that electricity, right? And just like in our homes, there is an inbuilt safety switch. If things get dangerous, something is broken, there is an inbuilt safety switch. There's a fuse that trips or a breaker that trips when the currents get too high. It protects the house from burning down. And our nervous system also has a way to protect us when things get too intense. So if there's overwhelm, or danger or shock, there's a shift in our nervous system for our protection. And a much older part of our brain takes over, no longer our neocortex, but a much older part of the brain, the reptilian brain, that moves into something to protect us that we've had for centuries, which is a long-standing and well-practiced form of survival. And that's fight, flight, or freeze. So that is our protective mechanism for overwhelm of the nervous system. And I'm telling you this because it will be relevant when we come to the collective trauma pieces, because there is the danger that it switches off because it's too intense. And here you can see this is a kind of a very brief moment of talking to you about how the nervous system happens within us. Here you can see that there is a normal range, this green range where the little wave just moves through. As long as we're in that range, we're in a good state, we're balanced. And you can see in the little box on the left, all the attributes that happen when we're in a balanced state in this normal range. And the normal range is a movement between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic is the part of us that activates us, that gets us going, that moves us, that keeps us active. And the parasympathetic is the part that helps us relax, slow down, chill out. And so those are the places between which we like to move within a day. We're active some part of the day, we come down more into the rest another part of the day. Now we constantly step out of the normal range, or often, and that's not a problem as long as it resets fairly quickly. It becomes a problem when we're in a stuck on or in a stuck off position. So if the sympathetic is constantly activated, then you will be in states of anxiety or panic, hypervigilance, chronic pain, sleeplessness. Then you're constantly in that agitated state and you need help coming down into the normal range. While if you're stuck in the off position, then you're suffering more of depression. You can't get out of bed. You're chronically tired. You have poor digestion. Things aren't moving well, and you need help coming up into the normal range. So those are the two places where it can become difficult and where the nervous system can shut us off. And I want to introduce one more concept before coming into the constellation world. This is the concept of the hungry ghosts. It originates in Tibetan Buddhism, and it speaks to the unembodied energies that cannot rest. And we see those very often in constellation work, that somebody's excluded, someone who's died hasn't been grieved. There's something that is not completed. And the Tibetans really have some beautiful rituals how to feed the hungry ghosts, how to clear some of those energies. And there's also a wonderful movie, if you have not seen it, that speaks a lot to this. It's called The Wisdom of Trauma, and is produced by Gabor Mate and his team. But the underlying principle here is that everything waits to be noticed. The hidden wants to be seen before it can relax. Now, if a traumatized generation cannot process what happened, then that load will be passed forward through two mechanisms. One is the DNA, and the other is a cultural adaptation to this trauma. That means it lands through the DNA and the descendants of each person that suffered, but also the culture in which it happened. We'll have to find ways to adapt and create safety around how to move forward. And that's where collective trauma work begins. So basically, to summarize that, in moments of trauma, information gets shut down. The nervous system will close it down. Or with the image again, the house will stay dark. And the trauma therefore stays unconscious. We can't see it, it's under cover. And often our bodies go numb. They create a place within of numbness, so we do not feel that part of ourselves. And there it sits. And what cannot move stagnates and gets frozen. It goes numb or dark. And we call those absences because they're really the opposite of presence. In those places within us, we are not present, we are absent. And then we are more ghost-like because it's not alive with consciousness, it's dark. So those are some of the concepts, and I'm going to make this a little more concrete now. I wanted to give you an example of an absence. And when it comes to the collective, I feel most comfortable talking about my own collective background. But I'd like you to kind of consider, well, what's in my culture, in my system that is absence? And we're going to do an exercise later so you can explore that a little bit. But as an example of an absence, here's a little bit of my own history. So I was born in 1958 in Germany, post-World War II. The war ended in 1945. By 1958, the rubble was removed. Most of the houses were rebuilt, and people were really hoping to move forward. So 56 and 58 were the baby boom years in Germany, which meant people were having families again, they were having babies again after the war. And in order to move forward, something happened in this culture. It almost was like a memo went out that everybody agreed to. There was some kind of silent agreement. There was a wall built that nobody will speak about the war. It was simply put in the past and not mentioned again. People moved on. And I was born into that moving on time. And what's really interesting about that is when I grew up, I thought things were really good. And I really didn't think I had anything to do with this war that I heard has happened, but that's all I knew about. So it never entered my consciousness much. I didn't learn in history class about World War II until I was 17 years old. It was not mentioned. I believed Jewish people were some ancient race like the ancient Egyptians, because nobody would use these words. Nobody spoke about Jewish people. There was so much shame and guilt in our culture. It wasn't spoken about. And so this silence became the protective mechanism of the culture, so it could move forward. And I was born into it, so to me, it felt perfectly normal. I had no understanding that this silence was a protective mechanism. And what's really interesting is that when I was 17 in school, the history included World War II now. Clearly, there had been movement in the culture that our children need to know what happened. But the teachers all were so traumatized. They really didn't do a very good job teaching that subject. And in my class, the teaching was basically, well, you all know World War II happened. I'm going to show you a movie so you see what really happened. And then they showed 17-year-old girls a brief movie about the opening of Birkenau concentration camp. And it was horrendous. Half the class ran out to throw up. There were no conversations about it. And it was just like this terrible thing landed in us. And then on the bus ride home, I realized that I was not going to mention this to my parents. So I was very loyal to that silence. And that's a cultural adaptation, an architecture in a culture, how to move forward from collective trauma. And over the years, as I went back, I started seeing the culture begin to digest what happened. There were movies, Hitler in the bunker. There were some magazines out, there were articles, there were books. Slowly but surely, it came out of the shadows and back into consciousness a little bit. And of course, there's still more to do. But there is an example of how a culture adapts around massive collective trauma. So part of this explanation is that I would like to introduce a way that in constellation work, we can begin to change our focus to include some of this, I want to call it cultural architecture in each culture that holds the collective, that is loaded with these hungry ghosts, loaded with unfinished energetic processes. And the way we have done constellations before is really working for one client, moving into what this issue for the one client is. And we look at the ancestral lineages, the paternal and the maternal side. We look where the pattern begins, and we're trying to see what we can do to help this person clear a pattern, which may include doing some healing in the ancestral line. I want to say that healing one person at a time at this point is just not enough. It's a beautiful process, and I love doing it in my workshops and things. And I feel we need to bring this collective into our healing work also, to have higher impact, to have a much bigger group that we are working with. And that is kind of what we have had as a goal in the Pocket Project. When we started working with these labs, we experimented there with working with one collective trauma issue at a time and inviting a larger group to see how can we digest this particular collective trauma. And when I say collective trauma, there's so many. We worked quite a bit. I worked in 2 labs on immigration, one in the US and one in Israel. We worked with child trafficking. We worked with patriarchy. We worked with slavery. We worked with indigenous genocide. So there's a lot of collective issues that are still sitting unresolved in our cultures. And what I'm trying to work with here tonight and show you how we did it is how can we activate that larger field, and through that larger field reach many more people than the one-on-one or the small group processes. And I'm happy to talk more about the labs later, but I want to show you there. So I want to show you these circles that I've been working with. So this is a circle of our work as far as I've done it in family constellation work. I call it from the inside out because it begins with the innermost circle where there is a client, an individual, a person who says, here's my issue. And then we use a group. We have our representatives, we have our circle around this person in support and in coherence. And then we look for where this issue may originate. And we look in the ancestral circle, which is the second circle out. And that's all the ancestry of this person. And sometimes we end up in the collective. So, for example, if you do a constellation in Germany, because World War II is so close, you very often end up in that collective trauma because parents or grandparents were affected by it. But we may not. We may just be in the smaller circle of the individual and the ancestry. And by the way, the collective is always a group, and it doesn't have to be a country. It can be a religion, it can be a culture, but it is a group of people that we belong to. And the circle around that, there are always larger fields around the fields. So the larger field around the collective, that field, I've called it nature, but it really involves all my relations. It involves animals, it involves the four directions, it involves the elements, water, air, fire, all of it. So there is this whole larger field that we are part of, that is around us, that is a resource to us, that we could also access in constellations. And on the outermost field, there is the largest field, which is the universal field, the unity consciousness, or you can call it spirit. Some people call it the divine or space. So that's the largest resource we have, the largest perspective we can see from, right? And in a healthy, open field, these are fluid. You can move in and out. You can step into each one of them and gain a different perspective of the same issue. So we can easily connect. But what's happening, I think, in our fields is that at this point, this collective has so much pain in it that has not been processed, that it's almost like a bit of a crust there that is not allowing us to move further out. We have so lost our connection with nature and the earth, thus climate change, and nobody's really doing that much about it because we're so stuck in those inner three fields that we don't easily connect out to nature or the universal. So that is why I was hoping maybe we can invite the collective more in, so to speak, as the client that we are working with. So a little bit more on what is this collective trauma field. So you've seen the collective is just the group that we're born into, right? And again, the same thing that happens in a family system when trauma is unbearable also happens in our communities, in our countries, in our cultures. That's where those safety switches trip and the flow of consciousness and perception turns dark, right? So when that light is turned off, there is a darkness. Those of us who are born into it, the next generation, we grow in that darkness and we consider it normal. We have no consciousness of it being dark, being unusual, right? So that's where it gets so complicated. We cannot feel it, we cannot see it because it's an absence. And we grow up in it, like I described in my own story. And these absences, they translate into beliefs, into cultural agreement. Some call it cultural architecture of shadows. They can be in language patterns, in cultural shadows, and that becomes hardwired into the next generation. It's a little bit like I was reading somewhere that at this time, there is more plastic in the oceans than body of fish. Just think of that for a moment. There's more plastic than body of fish. And yet every fish that's born into it considers it normal. It's just how it is. That's what I'm born into. So I think we're in a little bit of that state in our cultures, that there's so much alarm around so many things, and yet we kind of think it's normal. We're used to it. And so then the whole culture unconsciously agrees on that somehow, on these contracts that exclude the unresolved trauma. So reality is not always recorded in history books. You know, when my daughter went into 6th grade here in the US, her first year of history, of US history, began with the arrival of the Pilgrims in Plymouth. That was the beginning of US history. Not a word about all those people who were here before then. So our history books don't necessarily record reality, but that field that we work with in constellation, that underlying wave field, that morphic field, that holds the culturally unresolved past, just as it does in our families. It holds it for the group consciousness also, right? And when we constellate the collective, it emerges, we see it. There's no way of hiding it when we constellate it. And then we can start working with it, because all unresolved trauma will keep repeating itself in order to find some completion or healing. And so here is the way we have been working with the collective in constellations. So instead of a client in the middle of our group, we invite in a collective trauma theme, right? So for example, if we were to invite in the theme of immigration, which is quite a disconnect for many families in this US culture, definitely, because there were people left behind. It is not my home earth, and I'm in a new country, and there is this separation, there is this disconnect often. So we invited that in as the theme of the constellation. And then we constellated. We usually gather the representations from the group. Who should be in this constellation? And then we put it up. Let's say the people left behind, the people who immigrated, their descendants, the people whose land it was before it was taken away, the people who were the perpetrators, which is why I had to leave. Somehow we do that collective constellation, and a lot of things show up around it. And then we work a lot with, how does that land in me? What's my part in this? Because we all perpetuate these architectures because we're part of them. They live in us. They're not out there. They're in here. And as long as I keep perpetuating, I'm part of the problem and not part of the solution. So there is two parts to it. One's understanding more of the dynamics, and then really seeing what emerges in me around these themes. And there we do a lot of work with attunement in the group, a lot of work so the group can hold it and work with it. And we need to connect to the larger fields. And I'll talk much more to that. So you see the arrows. We're constantly trying to bring in a higher frequency into the circle. We're inviting in light, we're inviting in care, we're inviting in attention, focused, higher vibrational frequency, so that we can move through the clearing of what's still left within us in this collective trauma field. We want to upgrade that information. And there are certain things that are way beyond us. So when we're like, if I were to say, I want to bring the Holocaust in the center of this group, that is way too big for any small group. It's a very large, energetic field, and nobody can forgive that or can clear that. There we can only invite in grace and larger field to come in and help us move as much of it as we can move. So I hope this is kind of easy enough to understand. There is the invitation of the larger field into the center of the group with all its intensity that we're trying to invite and digest and integrate through the people in the group. So a few words to how to work with that, because constellations, we all know, are uniquely qualified to make fields visible. That's the beauty of it. It shows you what's really going on. Even if you don't have the information, the field brings it in and shows you the underlying dynamics in the family system as well as in the collective. So that's why it's so great to begin with that. But then the collective fields are intensely charged. They are really not just, a family trauma. They are way bigger than that. So you can think of them like a high voltage situation, which challenges our nervous systems. They're intense. So for example, let's say you're working racial issues in your group, and there are people from different races and there's conversation. It can get very intense and it can easily overwhelm our nervous systems. And often I notice that we then sort of step out, we become a little disembodied. We talk about it, but we no longer are in it. We do not sense it or feel it in our bodies. We kind of leave our bodies, we step out. So that's the one danger, to become a little theoretic about it or philosophical. And the other danger is that the conversation gets so intense that it blows up. And many people who work in the diversity field have had these experiences, that the intensity of the issues are so strong that the conversation blows up and becomes more of a re-traumatizing moment rather than a healing moment. So that's why I wanted to share some of the tools that we've been exploring. How do you work with these high voltage things without tripping the safety switch of that nervous system that we talked about before? How do we hold it in a way that we don't go way up and stay in these stuck on situation? That's not helpful for anybody. How do we regulate it so we stay in that green zone enough so we can work with it? Or if we do go out of the green zone, that we can co-regulate and come back down rather than fall apart. And the biggest need in here is to build a very strong container in the group so that the group learns how to stay present with it and integrate this collective field. So we always spend quite a bit of time preparing the group to become a we space that can hold that kind of intensity. How? Well, we teach skills of self-alignment, self-regulation, self-resourcing, and a lot of work with group attunement. Because if we're all together and we're attuned to each other, our nervous system can hold a lot more than if it's just a single person. So the attunement to the group is one of the biggest pieces of work we do. And if we have that, then we can co-regulate. If someone gets triggered, we can help them ground because the rest of the group can help it. It's not the whole group who blows up. So we learned a lot about how to do that. The other piece here is that to stay in positive relationship in the group, if there are these ruptures that will absolutely occur when you work with a collective. So because if we're related and connected, again, we can help each other and hold each other, right? Because trauma usually occurs when we're alone, when we don't have enough support to move through it, to integrate it. Then we have to numb it and put it away. If we have support support and we're connected, we can move through it and it doesn't become trauma. It doesn't sit in us like a numb spot that we can't access. So staying in positive relationship is very important. And that may often mean slowing the group way down so we can work on what needs to happen so we can stay in that. So there we practice meditation, witnessing, and recognizing the triggers. And always throughout the process, working with increasing the light frequency in the circle with meditation or movement or laughter or goodness, so that that light can keep coming through and help us process what's difficult in the systems. And the last thing here is also we always invite one of the larger fields to hold us. Because just like in a family system, you look for that backing, you look for that support from behind. We also invite that into the collective. Sometimes we set up the 4 directions, even before a workshop, where we have representatives for the 4 directions that hold the field while we're in there working the collective. Sometimes we each invite our homeland as a strengthening piece, or this nature field and the anchor points we have in there. Or we go way out and invite in that universal field to hold us. So it's important to keep the support from behind us with us as we go in. So now if you think we've been there, we're sitting in it, we're finding the collective issues, it's difficult, there's a lot of darkness, what do we do? There's pain from generations. So what do we do here as a group? And so this is where we look for, where can it shift? What can we do to move it? How are we're present with it, but what helps us heal it? And this is really much like in any constellation. You look for the points of potential in the pain. And I often ask myself in those moments, where is the love within this pain? Where is the loyalty, the love, the connection in this pain? And the moment you find that, you have a potential for opening. It's a little like, the yin-yang signs, that in the darkness, there is this dot of light. And we're looking for that dot of light. And once we find that, that's what we relate to. And we kind of try to open that up, because there is the potential for movement. So that's where we stay and we hold it with our synchronized circle. And we're inviting what was absent to become present. And this is where the coherence of the group has the power to integrate those absences and bring them into presence. And once they're present, they're no longer waves. They kind of go. They're not ghosts. They kind of clear. And as in that process, you have to prepare yourself for some intensities. They certainly will come. And in each of these workshops, I want to bring that home, that these thought forms, the beliefs, the collective structures are something that we create. We human beings create those thought forms. We create those shadow architectures. We perpetuate it because we believe it. We are grown in it. We're born in it. So there's always this piece of work. What's mine in this? Because we're often not conscious how we are holding up the very structures that keep that darkness going. We hold the pieces of puzzles within ourselves. And that's where we work always in the last day of these workshops. What's mine in it? And again, none of us can go into this collective alone. It's way too overwhelming. But when we go together, we can go into it, work it, and then see what's mine in it, and hold each other as we try to clear that out. Yeah, so I think I've said most of that already. Just to say one more time, the higher coherence in the group invites the lower coherence, the absence, to come up and be seen and be integrated. That's the process. And then we work with each person, and very often there's one collective constellation, then there's process, and there's a number of personal constellations, because now what comes up for each person is how they're participating in this, and we work with trying to clear that. Yeah, and this is Thomas Hübel's wave, and it's kind of ridiculously made simple here. There's nothing that's simple about it, but the whole movement is that you attune to this collective piece. You introduce it in an attuned circle. You do what you can to integrate as much as you can for each person, and you reattune to the same issue again. And as the group coheres into higher and higher frequency, more of the theme can come up on a deeper level, and the process repeats itself. And at the very end, to close this off now, there is always an integration process. So we've done this work, we've cleared things, and now we need some space for the unconscious to move. We've done as much as we can to make it conscious. So now at the end of this, we're trying to create space for the unconscious to come out. This can be through artwork, through poetry, through dance, or any kind of artistic expression, so that there's a movement also that isn't all verbal and mental. Yeah. So I brought the example of the immigration workshop, because there, what we did is we put up a piece of paper on the wall, and people had the choice to sit and share and speak about what they got out of it and what they took from it and what part of them was in it. Or they could go to the art wall and express it through art. And here is what was created that day. It's quite a magical day. So here's just a brief summary. Some of these things I haven't said, so I just have a chance to say them. This is some thoughts of what to do when you're working with a collective. We said create a strong container that is attuned and can hold what you bring into its middle. Then you work in a team. I haven't really spoken about that much, but don't move into the collective on your own. Have a team with you, and have a team that is diverse, because it's very easy to get polarized in these intensities. I've certainly been burnt more than once in that situation when I, for example, was the only white woman in a group of Black people, and we were talking about racial issues. It's very easy to become the enemy, and the whole thing gets super intense. So you're way better off with a team of people around you of different races if you're working with racism, or different genders if you're working on gender. Just make sure you have a good diversity. And to bring in the resources that are needed for people. So you move at a speed that is helpful to everybody, not to keep moving too fast. And the people in your circle need to develop the skills and competencies to stay present. And of course, that's for the facilitators more than anybody else, being able to be present. Including self-regulation skills. So there is a understanding of the group too charged right now. How are we in this group? Are we close to overwhelm, or are we good? So learning how to sense the group and regulate that level is also very important. I spoke about attunement and positive relationship, and about co-regulation when someone gets triggered. And always to be prepared to welcome intensity, because it comes with the collective. The collective is intense. That's just how it is. So that's where I want to leave this with: buckle your seatbelt and enjoy the ride, because there is much to learn from being in the collective. And I will end again with Tiokasin. He speaks about returning to our rightful place. We spoke about relationship to the earth, and he said, well, it's really strange to say we can save the earth. The arrogance of that. We can't save it. It's about allowing Mother Nature to save us. I often wonder what people mean when they say nature. People say nature is beautiful or needs to be healed, but it's always out there, over there, separate. The experience of the native person who lives the voice of Mother Earth is a different paradigm than Western reasoning, which is based in denial of indigenous thinking. And I'll close us with this image. This is an image I love very much. This is taken in South Africa at the Dagara tribe. And what you see is the oldest member of the tribe welcoming in the newest member of the tribe. And they have a belief that if you listen to the great mystery, which the baby just has left, this baby may bring a message from the great mystery to the elder who is about to step back out into the great mystery. And he's listening for messages on how to close his life with as much grace as possible. And this is the kind of fluidity between the different layers all the way out to the great mystery that we can have if we listen carefully. So thank you all so much for listening. This is the presentation. And if you're up for it, then we're gonna go and do a little exploration now. Let's see what time we have. We have a whole hour. I could also open for a couple of questions if that's helpful. If anyone has a really hot question, I'm open to taking a couple of those before we move into more of an exploration.